just wanted to cover some of the things first. So, well, the first thing you have to do when you're going to do a build on a van is decide, will I insulate that van? If you do, then that affects every decision you make. And if you decide that insulation is not that important, you don't need insulation or it's actually harmful, then that affects everything else you decide. One of the first decisions you'll have to decide when you make buy a van, is do you get a high top passenger van or cargo van? So if you want a high top, they're hard to find in cargo. You probably have to get a passenger conversion van and get a high top. They do exist on cargo vans, but they're not common. So do you want a cargo van or passenger van? And that is determined by, do you want to insulate or not? I want to insulate. So I definitely wanted a cargo van, because with a passenger van, to insulate, first you have to pull everything off the walls so you can get to the walls, and it's all pretty stuff, there's no doubt about it. Most passenger vans are very pretty, but then you have to pull everything off just in order to get into them. The big thing are the ribs. You can see the rib here. This comes with a standard with my GMC van, and these ribs came with it, or I don't know if it's standard or not, but they came with it. And so you see how this is attached to these ribs. Well, that's how I'm going to attach either paneling or insulation. So you got to know where the ribs are. How do you know where the ribs are if it's all covered with plastic and carpet? You can't. So you can't just start screwing in hoping you hit a rib. You got to know where the ribs are. So with a cargo van, I look in here, here's the rib. I know I'll put a mark at the top, at the bottom, so I can always identify exactly where the rib is. Makes it so much simpler. Not only that, but I probably want to insulate in between the ribs. You can see how there's this big gap between these two ribs. Well, what I'll do is I'll cut styrofoam sheets and put it in here in between the ribs. So I have to know where the ribs is before I can do any of that. If you've decided to insulate your van, then a cargo van makes that much, much easier, which is one of the main reasons I bought a cargo van. In the debate over passenger van, cargo van, the big question is, can you live without the windows? I mean, it can feel very small and closed in without windows. Some people can't live without them. If you can't live without the windows, then you'd better buy a passenger van. It's just that simple. I don't, and I did get, I'll swing you around here, I did get on this van, you can see windows in the side door. And to me, those windows in the side door and the windows in the back door make it work just fine. I'm completely satisfied with that. So that's all the windows I care about. I'm good with that. Windows in the side door, the big open gap up front, and windows in the back door. That's good enough for me. So in every way, a cargo van is better for me. Then you need to decide about a high top. I got to tell you, I like a high top. Every vehicle I've ever lived in until now had a high top. I lived in a box van for 6 years. Well, it was 7 foot tall from the factory. There's no high top. It just was a box van. And then after that, I lived in a truck camper that I built. It was a very tall shell. It was a home-built shell, and the shell was, I had to stoop a bit, but I can live with stooping a bit. So I was very happy with it for the height. And then after that, I lived in a cargo van, cargo trailer. Well, again, the cargo trailer was over 6 foot in the top, even after I added insulation, and so I could stand up in it. This was my last van, my 2001 Chevy Express, was the only vehicle I've ever lived in that I could not stand up in, the low top. I found it entirely bearable. I can live with a low top. Here's the thing. I had a bed near the front door, the side doors. I stepped in, I sat down. I never stooped. The only time I ever stood in the van was to go to the bathroom and to do that business, and that requires some, when you're going pooping, you got to do some standing up. And then when I changed my clothes. Other than that, I almost never stood in the van. If I needed to get up and do something, I just kneeled and did it. I'm thinking in this van I might even get an office chair and use the office chair to slide around in. I'm not even sure I'll do that. So the question, these are all interrelated. Will you insulate? If you insulate, determines whether you need a cargo van or a passenger van. And then the windows come into question. Can you live in a cargo van without windows? So all these things are really tied together. It's like a pawn playing a game of chess where one pawn moves and impacts the whole game. The king might be most important, but the pawn can win the game just by being sacrificed to get the king. So that's what happens in the van build. The little parts, the little decisions become critical. Will you insulate? Can you live without windows? Okay, so I am going to insulate. I'm a big believer in insulation. And then the question is, how will you insulate? Now, this is an area where I really disagree with a lot of people. I'm going to disagree with the majority of people on YouTube who believe that Reflectix is insulation. It is not. It doesn't claim to be insulation. It has an R value of 1, which is non-existent. Glass is nearly 1. The steel sidewall on this is nearly 1. It's non-existent. That's piss poor insulation. It's not insulation. Reflectix does not claim to be insulation. It is a reflective barrier. That's all it does. Heat hits it and it bounces off. Heat hits it, bounce it off. It's superb in your windows. The heat from the sun, that's what we're talking about there, reflected heat, radiant heat. It's a radiant heat barrier. The radiant heat from the sun goes through the glass, passes easily through, it's very low R value, hits the Reflectix and passes right back out, and it cools tremendously if you put Reflectix in the windows. So we think it works so well, it must be great insulation. It is not. It is a radiant heat barrier only. Now, the glass, when it hits it and bounces off, it just passes through that glass almost like air, literally almost like air. So it doesn't need an air gap. For Reflectix to work inside your van, it requires a minimum of a ½ inch gap between it and the surface. So if you put it on a wall, and if you glue it directly to the wall, here's the wall of the van, here's the Reflectix. You glue it on. Spray glue, there it goes. It's worthless. Let me say that again. It is worthless. Take the dollar you spend on it, tear it up into bits, flush it in the toilet. That's how much value you've got for that dollar. Zero. It has to have an air gap. The Reflectix hits the steel of the wall, that absorbs it. It's no longer radiant heat. And it re-radiates it. And then it is somewhat radiant heat. It hits the Reflectix, it bounces back. If it can't hit the Reflectix and bounce back, the Reflectix absorbs the heat. If it's the Reflectix and the steel wall are like this, the heat transfer is direct. There is no radiation. It's conduction. And conduction heat, it's worthless. Reflectix is worthless against conduction. And if the two objects are touching each other, it's not radiant heat, it's conducted heat. And it's worthless. Garbage. Nothing. Now, it is some slightly. It's R1. So yes, people will say, oh, I put it on them. I love it. Well, you get R1 value, and maybe that does better than just the steel wall by itself. So what I'm saying to you is, don't buy Reflectix and glue it to the wall. Put an air gap in, and then it will actually work and do a pretty fair job. It's very good at what it does, but it does not prevent conduction. And if the Reflectix is against the steel wall, it's conduction and not radiant. There's nowhere for it to radiate. Radiate means it passes through either air or a vacuum. The heat from the sun leaves the sun, passes through a vacuum, hits the atmosphere, passes through the atmosphere, hits the glass in your wall, passes in your van, passes through the glass in the van easily. So that's radiant heat. Conducted heat. The heat from the sun hits the steel wall, then it's conducted. It's no longer radiant heat. The Reflectix is only a radiant heat barrier. It's virtually worthless as insulation. It has no R value of 1. And I imagine that's made up. It is made up, there's no question. There are no government standards for R value in radiant barriers because they have none. There are no government standards, there are no industry standards. It's a number of the Reflectix company made up out of the air, R1. So if you're going to use Reflectix, you must have a ½ inch minimum air gap. I'm not going to use Reflectix because I don't want to give up the ½ inch. Some people use bubble wrap, and that's the ½ inch. Maybe that works. They say it does. I don't know. I'm not going to find out because I'm not a fan of Reflectix on walls. It just doesn't do the job I want. I'm going to use styrofoam, either polyiso or XPS, extruded polystyrene. Right now I have polyiso because that's what I found. It's hard in the desert. It's hard to find foam panels of insulation. So I had to go out of my way to find polyiso. I had to drive 100 miles to get polyiso, which is by far the best insulation. That polyiso will be cut to go in between the ribs. We'll take these off, cut the polyiso to fit between the ribs. It will go in. This has a curve to it. Polyiso does not curve. XPS, which is pink and blue. When I say XPS, extruded polystyrene, that is the pink or blue insulation, sheet styrofoam insulation. They bend quite well. In the half-inch size, it would conform to this, but I couldn't find any, so I bought polyiso. I may have to cut this in sections so it can have less of a curve, but that's fine. That won't be any real problem. So this will be polyiso set inside the ribs, half-inch, because that's what I have. And that will go in there. Then these will go back on, and I will put paneling on it just to make it attractive. I'm undecided on what to do with the roof. That's the walls. So the walls will be like that. I'll try to fill stuff in these cracks here. So these are everywhere. All the ribs, everywhere. There's little holes. I'm going to stuff these with bat insulation, fiberglass bats. So that's what will go out there. I'll stuff this. Now, if I'm going to be really serious about insulation, I would put another half-inch sheet on the outside, and then I would just screw in directly into the ribs. So I put a half-inch sheet out here. This is a thermal bridge. If I insulate here and here on both sides, but not this, the heat will transfer right through this. That's a thermal bridge. But if I put a half-inch here and a half-inch sheet over the entire wall, then I eliminate the thermal bridge, and I have a 1-inch total, which on polyiso is about R7. R7 is very, very good on a wall of a van. I lose a half-inch, but not really, because if I put this back on to put the paneling right on it, then I lose a half. This is 3/4 of an inch, and so I'd only lose half an inch. So that's a plus, and I may go ahead and do that. I'm kind of undecided on some of this. I'll decide as I go along. Some of this will evolve. This is all evolving. One of the big questions was, what about the roof? And I'm undecided almost totally about the roof. I'm going to put a high top on this eventually, either this year or the following year, whenever I save enough money. I couldn't find a high top. All I could find high top in was in conversion vans, and they were very expensive. It was new enough to last me the rest of my life, which was a top priority to me. Any high top vans I found were in conversions, and they were 30 grand and up, and I couldn't afford that, and I just wasn't going to consider that. So no high top. I'll put the high top on. The most expensive high top that I might want to put on would be $4,000, and I believe I can get it done for like $2,000. So I paid $19,000 for the van. If I pay $2,000 to get the high top installed, I got $21,000 invested, and again, a van that will last me 20 years. I mean, this van is a 2015 with 12,000 miles. It's going to last me a long time. And I got it for $2,000 below book. That means if I spend $2,000 to get a high top installed, then I've paid low book, and I'm still very happy with that. And book will be higher because then it will have a high top. So my thinking right now is that I will just not insulate the roof and live without insulation on the roof for a year, and then because it's just going to get cut off when I put the high top on. So I'm kind of undecided on that. I don't have to decide. The walls have to be decided first. You got to do the walls before you do anything else. Okay, one more thing I have not talked about: the floor. Some people go crazy. I was going to say something else that would probably offend you about the floors. I am not a believer in insulating floors. The floor is going to be cold. You're not going to keep the van floor cold. What I do is I wear a good down bootie, and my feet stay warm. So I can insulate. I can keep my feet warm, or I can fight and struggle to keep the floor warm. And that's not going to happen. I'm not going to keep this floor warm. If it's in the teens, the floor's going to be cold. So I'm not going to lose an inch. I'm not going to put down any insulation. I'm not going to put down any plywood. There will be nothing on the floor but area rugs. That's the only thing on the floor. I'll accept a cold floor. That's part of life. Now, before you say, well, Bob, you're just wildly conjecture. You don't have any idea how to live in a cold van, do you? Everything you're saying is wrong. You're wrong, wrong, wrong. All you people are out there thinking that right now. I lived in a box van for 6 years very comfortably in, wait for it, Anchorage, Alaska. 30 below every single winter I lived in that van. I know cold. I know staying warm in a van in a cold area. I can't believe there's anyone out there that knows it better than I do. If you lived in Fairbanks for 6 years, you know it better than I do, because Fairbanks is a whole lot colder than Anchorage. Anchorage is plenty cold enough. 30 below was a routine thing for me in Anchorage. I kept my box van warm at 30 below. I know how. I lived in Alaska for 45 years. I built a house, I built a cabin, I insulated them. I studied extensively insulation. I have devoted a great deal of my time and energy to studying and understanding insulation and how it works. I have a basis for everything I'm telling you. I've studied it, I know it, I've done it. That's why you should maybe consider what I'm saying about insulation. So, I will not insulate the floor. If I insulate the roof, it will be with 1 inch of polyiso, and I will insulate the walls, because there's just never any harm in insulating the walls, and it's worth it to do it to me now. And then I'll start doing the inside build. So I know this was long and kind of convoluted, passenger van versus cargo. Buy a cargo van. I'm just a huge fan of cargo vans. I would not even consider a passenger van. The passenger vans are pretty. Here's another thing that a knock against the passenger vans. All the crap they put on them, they put in ducting across the top where heaters blow out and air conditioning blows out. That all takes a huge amount of space, and you're constantly bonking your head on it. And I know, because I spent 3 months living in a passenger van that constantly bonked my head on it. So just in every way, I think cargo vans are better. I do not recommend Reflectix glued to the walls. That's a terrible idea. If you put in a barrier as a radiant barrier with an air gap, it works very well. Okay, one last thing. Is there ever a time when you should not insulate? Yes. If you are going to live, again, this is going to be completely the opposite of everything that everyone else is going to tell you. If you live in a hot place and you are not concerned about heat, cold, only heat, if you live in Florida, you live in Hawaii, do not insulate. Insulation is a bad idea. The heat is coming into the van, no matter how much insulation you put in it. By mid-afternoon, late afternoon, the heat is inside, and then as it cools off, the insulation won't let it out. It delayed it coming in, yes it does, but on a hot day, the heat is coming in, it's getting in, heat is insidious. Unless you're running air conditioning to force it cool, that heat is coming in, and then overnight, all the heat insulation you put in keeps it in. It's pretty darn good at that. It can't keep it out, it's not good enough, but once it's in, it will keep it in and warm for 2, 3, 4, 5 more hours until bedtime, and you're trying to go to sleep, and it won't cool off. If you're dealing with heat and not with cold, do not insulate, period. Now, I would do Reflectix. This is where Reflectix would be great. Do Reflectix. So put your 1/2 inch gap, 3/4 I would suggest, and then a layer of Reflectix, and you're good. That will keep all the heat, that will delay the heat, and it will even keep it kind of cooler in the evening. So I know my views on insulation are controversial, but they're based on a lot of experience. I'm not guessing, I'm not wondering, I've done all this stuff. I've been doing it for 15 years. I have a basis for what I'm saying. So, I highly recommend insulating unless you're only worried about heat. I recommend foam insulation instead of Reflectix. Unless you're only worried about heat, then Reflectix is the answer. And that'll be it. And then we'll actually do it, and I'll take videos and showing you actually doing it. This is just another talking head video. I'm sorry about it, but how do I relate this information to you if I don't just become a talking head? Okay, so I'll stop there, and we'll actually start doing something. How about that? Actually doing something. And we'll do that coming up. In the meantime, like us on YouTube, subscribe to our channel, and we will talk to you, Warden, in the next video.